Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming back for another episode of the Logos of Love podcast. A couple of notes. This is part 2 of our 3-part series on love and justice. I wanted to make a note that this episode does have a few moments where we're kind of glitchy because of internet problems. We do apologize for that, but hopefully you're still able to enjoy it and take away something to help enrich your life. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming back for another episode of the Logos of Love podcast. I am here, Kyle, along with Chris. Chris, I know it's been a few weeks since we've put out an episode to our listeners and viewers. I'm sure they've missed our beautiful, lovely voices, maybe not so much faces, and are looking forward to hearing us again. So we apologize for the hiatus, but hopefully we'll be able to get these a little bit quicker over the summer. What say you, Chris?
I'm glad to be back. It's been a crazy, crazy time of transition for a lot of things in my life. So I will say that it's certainly partially been my fault, probably majority been my fault. So I apologize to all of our listeners. We will try to be more consistent moving forward.
You had a
And
busy schedule. I had a busy schedule. You got sick. I got sick. It's just been one of those things. And
Yep.
woe is life. That's the way things go. And when you have full-time jobs and families and other things, when you do something like this as a hobby that you're not having income for, it makes it a little bit harder to make it as its number one priority. So we understand. Our listeners understand. They get it.
Right. But I do want to say I'm committed to try to do it more consistently like we were doing before. So
Yeah.
looking forward to get back into it today and keep it moving along, because there's still a lot to go over. There's always more to talk about when we're talking about God and the love of God specifically as we get moving forward here.
Sure, absolutely. Well, it's going to be Memorial Day when this episode will be dropping. So hopefully you all are having a wonderful Memorial Day weekend. I know as you're listening yesterday, I would have been at the Coke 600. My wife, who is a designer at Liberty, was designed William Byron's car for the Coke 600, and I'd look to go to the race anyway as I'm a NASCAR fan, but hope to be able to go and see maybe him get into the winner's circle. Chris, I know you said you were talking about barbecuing this weekend, so hopefully any barbecue that you pulled out for Memorial Day weekend has been delicious and tasty to this point in time.
Well, I'm hoping. I'm not sure exactly. As you know, Kyle, my wife is my calendar, so I kind of just go with the flow. But I'm pretty sure if we were doing anything bigger than just barbecuing, and I would know about it. So I think we're just staying in town and maybe pulling out the barbecue, which we haven't done yet this year, and just it's been a good summer afternoon with the family. So, but obviously, I hope that all of our listeners are having a great Memorial Day and Memorial Day weekend as well.
Yeah.
So,
Now, Chris, on the grill, what is your go-to on the grill? What is your man grill specialty?
I'm not the best griller. I Now my kids say I'm pretty good, so I'll take that as a compliment. But
Yeah, the kids like their
um,
steak well done, so I don't know if I trust them.
oh,
So
gotcha. Well, I don't usually do steak, although I've tried and I think I did okay. But I usually just do burgers. You know, get some good old uh, chuck beef and add a little things to spice it up, a few things to spice it up, and put them on the grill. So I do my best to make a good burger.
you're saying this weekend now. I got to get mine out and got to at least. It's been a bit. I need to at least try to get on the Barbie again. So,
Yeah.
all right. Well, we are back again. Last episode was a little bit. We had recorded it, started it, did a long episode, and decided that we needed to split it up and go into a little bit different direction than what we did for the first part. So this is us recording the second part of that episode again. And as you said, Chris, we're looking at breaking this into a 3-part. So tell us where we're moving into tonight into this next episode and where we'll go for the third episode as well.
Yeah. So just a real quick recap. Obviously, our listeners, I mean, you could technically have just listened to the last episode, so you may not need much of a recap. but just so that we're established on what we're talking about justice. Um, so the last episode was about justice, and what we established there was that justice means, and in a biblical sense, it means to do what's right. It doesn't mean you get what you deserve, um, which is a lot of times what we think of in the Western world, but instead, dikaios means to do what's right. Dikaiosune, which is also a lot of times translated as justice, means to do what's right within a relationship. And so, what we talked about in detail last week is the fact that justice does not mean you get what you deserve. And it can't mean that to the biblical authors because they see justice as being primarily um, about doing what's right. And what we established last episode was that to do what's right is for God to show mercy and for God to forgive. And he is uh, just in doing so. So we went through a lot of passages that showed that justice and mercy and forgiveness and grace and love, they all go hand in hand, and they're thought about simultaneously because and one of the more famous verses that we ended up quoting last week was was the first John 9 1 that says, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just
Just
to
do is
forgive
what is
us,
right.
to forgive us our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness or all wrong ways of living. So,
Mhm.
so you get this idea that God is just in that he forgives, which is contrary to what a lot of us think when we think of justice. And so we were establishing that first and foremost, the idea that eye for eye, tooth for tooth, or you get what you deserve, which is very prevalent in the Western world, um, can't be the right understanding of biblical justice because those words, mercy, forgiveness, love, they all require you not giving someone what they deserve. You're literally not giving them a punishment that they deserve, or you're
Mhm.
giving them good standing when they don't deserve it. You're not keeping, not keeping records of wrongs as if to repay. So, those concepts, those considered right in the Bible according to God. And so that was a step last week. What we realized is we went way over, and what we realized is, what, we need to talk about the other aspects of justice, and we're going to divide that into two episodes this week. Um, the first step is going to be to step into vengeance. The reason for that is usually, um, and usually a lot of people will, when I explain that God's justice means that he forgives and shows grace and shows mercy, um, the first thing that they think of is, what about God's vengeance? Um, and to be fair, that's where I was tripped up too. Okay, well, I mean, that's great if that's what justice means. What about these passages that talk about God's vengeance? So that's kind of what we step into today. This idea that God tells us to forgive, but then it also says that God shows vengeance. So is he allowed to take vengeance, but we're not? So on and so forth. So that's kind of where we've been and where we're going. Any thoughts before we jump further into that, Kyle?
No, I know you said you kind of have some illustration that you can kind of give us that points to show us the tension that is created in culture. That's just the retribution, if you will, fair speaking, we deserve. So, if you want to continue with that and give it to us here.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, here's the thing. We need to understand that justice and then even vengeance, which is how we've translated specifically about four passages in Scripture. Um, that's even elevated over justice sometimes. It's this idea that it's not just an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. It's not just retribution, but do something, I'm gonna do something back. That not only make things equal, but really to make sure that you won't ever do it again, and to take out my emotional pain on you that you caused me, basically. Um, and I mean, it's simple as like instead of eye for eye, tooth for tooth, maybe it's like eye for two black eyes, like or something. You give me a black eye, I give you two, or something. Or like when you think of like movies
Payback
and
with interest, if you will.
yeah, payback with interest. Like you took out my son, like gangster movies. You took out my son, I'm gonna take out your whole family, or whatever it might be. So and a very common phrase in like the Western world, American culture is that you'll hear from time to time is, "What you want isn't justice; it's vengeance." Um, and so, what I first want to start off with saying is that, believe it or not, the word that we've translated as vengeance is edikaios. Now, if you're tracking with last week, dikaios means to do what's right. And then edikaios is just, it's got a different prefix in front of it. Basically, it means to set things right.
Mm-hmm.
It's it's the same kind of concept. It means to do what's right, or to something has gotten out of place, something wrong has happened, and it means to set things right. So it doesn't mean I would argue it doesn't even mean retribution, but it certainly doesn't mean what we think of when we say vengeance. The root word there is dikaios. So it's this idea of setting things right, putting things back the way they belong. Um, and that involves mercy and forgiveness. But absolutely, the passages that use that phrase seem to imply some sort of I have to deal with wrongs and afflictions that have been done. And so we're going to address those passages. Okay. So there's actually three in the New Testament. What's interesting um, is that they're all basically quoting one Old Testament passage. So the Old Testament verse that it comes from is Deuteronomy 32:35, which says, "It is mine to avenge," or "Vengeance is mine, I will repay," is how we
Mm-hmm.
usually translate it. Um, and so we need to understand that those are coming from that. Um, but I think what may help us understand, there's three New Testament passages: Romans 12:19, Hebrews 10:30, and Second Thessalonians 1:6. And today we're going to address Romans 12:19 and Hebrews 10:30. Next episode we'll address Second Thessalonians 1:6. But Romans 12:19 is the one we're going to start with, and the reason for that is, um, I'm not sure if our audience is aware or not. I know, Kyle, you are, but I've actually translated the book of Romans, um, and I'm going to read from my translation on Romans 12:17 through 21, because I think it's going to help us see how this would come across a lot differently if we translate it to set things right, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and Romans 12:17 through 21, and we'll go through it here. So it says this again. This is reading from my translation. So your translation may read a little differently, but track with the flow here. It says, "Do not render harmful afflictions to anyone, even if they have committed harmful afflictions against you. Instead, perform what is honorable before all people, even those who have done you wrong. If at all possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all people. For those of us who have experienced God's sacrificial love on our behalf, when we are wronged, We ought to never try to set things right on our own. Instead, we should leave room for God's passionate, ordered correction. For it is written, to set things right is mine, says the Lord, and I will render to each appropriately. So there's the verse, the last verse that I just read there is the 12:19, right? And the way I've rendered it is to set things right is mine, says the Lord, and I will render to each appropriately. Now, what I for a long time I struggled with the idea of vengeance, but when it's translated, I think more appropriately to setting things right, I think you get a much different picture. So, um, last episode we talked about this idea that hard concept for us to understand and comprehend, that I'm supposed to forgive and I'm supposed to show mercy, but God's going to execute vengeance. But that's not what this passage is actually saying. This passage is actually saying that it's God's job to set things right. Now, as a human who has other peers, it's not my job to set things right when you do something wrong, Kyle.
Hmm.
Um, but there are categories in life that all of us have where we are an authority figure. I think the most obvious is like a parent, right? So like I'm just naturally I have the responsibility over my to be over my children, and when something goes wrong, when someone does wrong, it's my job to set things right. And so what I hear here is, and I've can't even tell you how many times I've said this to my kids, but what I end up hearing being said here now, when we I think translate this more accurately to setting things right, is I hear a father saying, okay, let's say one child has done a wrong and pain the other child, or to the other sibling. And what happens all the time is they try to set things right on their own.
Hmm.
And maybe they try to take vengeance. Maybe they try to, maybe they try to retribution, whatever it is, they try to set things right. And what I end up doing is saying, hey, it's not your job to discipline my child. Trust me, I'm going to set it right. I'm going to take care of it. Right. And
Hmm.
so, that's the tenor of what I is being said is don't Romans 12:17 through 19 here is saying don't try to correct and don't try to set things right yourself. Leave room for me to come in and handle it appropriately. And you
Hmm.
noticed I do not think that the last word in the Greek either means to repay. It means to render appropriately. So handle the situation in the way that is right. Render appropriately back to them. So does that mean an equal payment? No, I'm not. I don't think that that's what that means. It means that I will deal. That something needs to be dealt with, and I will deal with it. Um, so that's going to be kind of, and I use that one because that happens to be the one that I've already translated.
Yep.
But it sets the tone for what the other passages are about. And it's really the heart of a father. I really think the more I study and the more I understand a lot of these concepts, the more I see, man, again, that's the heart of like a parent who loves their children and is saying, you don't do that. It's my job to discipline. It's my job to step in and handle when something's been wrong.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. So, how do the other passages then, like how like you mentioned the Hebrews, I believe is where we're going to go next. How does the other passages play into that as well?
Okay, so Hebrews Hebrews and Thessalonians are, I would say, um, they are difficult passages, especially because of the translation that we've chosen. Like vengeance is in there, but I'm going to go ahead because I don't have a translation. I'm just going to read to you. Um, I think this is the NASB that I have up, NASB. So I'm just going to read it to you, and then we're going to kind of dissect it here tonight as we go into this. Okay. So I'm going to start in the verse that actually says it is verse 30, but I'm going to read 28 through 31 to get just a little bit of the context. Otherwise, we're just reading vengeance is mine over and over again, or to set things right is mine over and over
Right.
again. Right. So let's a little bit of the context. In starting in verse 28, anyone who has ignored the law of Moses is put to death without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. So obviously, he's alluding to the Mosaic law. How much more severe punishment do you think he will deserve who has trampled underfoot the Son of God and has regarded as unclean the blood of the covenant of which he was sanctified, and has insulted the Spirit of grace? For we know him who said, vengeance is mine, I will pay. Or, if you're going to use my translation, to set things right is mine, and I will render appropriately. And again, the Lord will judge his people. It is a terrifying, fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Okay, so we have a passage where what is being discussed is um, taking lightly, and it's obviously talking about Christians who have taken lightly their calling, and as the term that the author of Hebrews says is trampled underfoot the Son of God. So it's like they're completely neglecting what God has called them to do, and probably living in complete and utter sin without any regard to it. So basically, he's saying that we should have fear here because God is a God who takes vengeance. And so translating it that way makes it seem like that's in that context makes it seem like, oh, actually God is going to be vengeful here. Um, First thing we need to understand is that God not only doesn't take vengeance, but he doesn't punish. Okay. Um, and so we're gonna go through that. And when I say punish, you got to understand the words retribution, punishment, penalty, they all have this idea of like a legal sense of you get what you deserve. So there's the law set up, and if you break that law, you get the exact penalty, you get the
Mhm.
exact punishment. Um, and so what we're talking about here is when we talk about this, we're talking about like punishment, right? And so a lot of times in these passages, the idea of punishment comes up as well, and we have to understand that God doesn't take what we think of when we think of vengeance or punishment. So let's spin it and talk about um, what he does do, though. Okay, and what he does do is he does discipline and he does chastise. Okay, um, so when he has to deal with someone who's done wrong, a child who's done wrong, what he does is he chastises and disciplines. Now, what gets really confusing, like in our English language, is we typically use these phrases interchangeably, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
A lot of times, I could easily say I had to go punish my kids, or I was disciplining my kids. We use those phrases interchangeably, but there's a very important difference, okay? Because um, if we take the word punishment um, and attach it to vengeance, and we say that punishment is what God is doing, then we're contradicting everything we said about God in the last episode, okay? Because punishment, the definition is to inflict or impose a penalty as retribution for an offense. And we established very clearly last week that God can't do retribution because what's just and right is forgiveness and mercy, right?
Yep.
Um, So if it's simply a matter of, and the easiest way to say that, I'll use this phrase probably in substitution of retribution, but God doesn't practice eye for eye, tooth for tooth. He tells us not to, and he doesn't. Okay. Um, now there are other ways to deal with it. That doesn't mean that God can't actually address someone's sin or someone's wrongdoing in a negative way. Um, so let's talk through that. Um, Discipline means training that corrects, molds, or perfects the mental faculties and moral character. That's
which
a lot different.
right, which makes sense when you think about the word and where how it has multiple meaning within the English language. Discipline, yes, can mean as a negative towards you. That at least the connotation that we have, like you discipline your child. However, I also have discipline on what I'm eating. I have discipline on what I'm watching. I have discipline on making sure I'm taking time to work on my golf game to improve on those things. Those are all positives that I'm just being disciplined to make sure I'm following an action to better myself.
Yes, exactly. Like obviously self-discipline, when we say self-discipline, we think of a positive thing, right?
Mhm.
But then sometimes when we apply it to like someone else having to discipline us, we think of a negative thing. But the point of discipline is that it's to correct and mold and perfect something. That's the whole point. And I'm sure I'm sure that our audience is tracking, and that's a lot different than punishment because punishment means you do something and you get the exact penalty that's set up, whatever that might be. Um, and so it's more of a retribution type thing, whereas
Mhm.
discipline isn't about retribution at all. Discipline is about training to correct and perfect.
I
And
think
then the
another way you could
last, the
almost
other word is
sorry, Chris. I was just thinking, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think another way you could almost put it into like a visual perspective is if we're going to use sports analogy, discipline would be the offensive line making sure to be disciplined not to jump before the start. That is disciplined. Punishment would be when they're not disciplined and they jump, there's a flag.
okay.
Okay,
We love the sports world in this
yes.
podcast. If you haven't noticed,
If you're not a
but
sports
yeah,
fan,
so
you can't jump before the ball is snapped, and if you do, then you get flagged and 5 yards back, and everybody gets angry at the team except for the other team who's happy that
right,
they made
yep.
mistakes. So, yeah.
So with that being said, yep. So with that being said, I think that discipline is obviously it's about the motivation. Here's the other thing that I want to say about that, and is that I can do the same action to my child. Let's say that um, I have decided that the punishment um, for breaking a specific rule is that they will go to their room for the night. Now that could be a punishment or it could be a discipline. The reason the what changes is my motivation. Is my motivation simply so vengeance would be my motivation is I'm personally hurt because you broke my command. And we're saying God doesn't do that. Um, Retribution would be you caused this harm and I've the penalty that we've decided that is equal and fair and what you deserve for that is this. And we're saying God doesn't do that either. And then there's discipline, which is I think the best way for you to learn your lesson so that you won't do that again, for me to sharpen your character, is for you to go to your room. So it's all about the motive on which term is appropriate. Is my motive as the person who's enforcing this? Is my motive to get even, um, to to take back because I'm hurt, vengeance, or is it uh, to to help the person who I love because I want them to learn from their mistake.
Mhm.
And so I'm going to apply some sort of discipline because I'm trying to help them learn better. Okay, and then the other word is chasten, or chastise, and that means to add worth to by forcibly correcting, to scourge and to correct by suffering, but in order to purify. Okay, so again, it's me acting out some sort of affliction, but the whole point is not because I'm hurt, not because I want them to get what they deserve. The whole point is I am trying to add to their worth. I'm trying to perfect them. I'm trying to purify them. So what we're saying is God disciplines and God chastises, take vengeance, and he doesn't punish, at least if you're talking about the dictionary version of these words. Um, so vengeance and punishment are ruled out because of last week's episode. And instead, I think we should opt for words that are like discipline and chastisement that still imply that I'm going to have that God is going to deal with these sins and wrongs, but that it's out of the motivation of our good in
Hmm.
both chastisement and discipline. Okay. Um, Now, what I really think backs this up, and I want to bring this in, and I did not come up with this on my own. Um, as I've talked about in the past, early church fathers, Eastern Orthodoxy, when I was studying this, and they pointed out several of the church fathers have statements basically indicating this. And I think the one that does it best is Clement. Okay. Now he's an early disciple, um, and he was writing probably in like the late 100s, early 200s, so a long, long time ago. And he said this. Here's a quote from him: "For there are partial corrections or disciplines, which is the Greek word paideia, which are called chastisements. Colossus is the Greek word there, which many of us who have been in transgression incur by falling away from the Lord's people. But as children or their father, so we are by providence, by God. But God does not punish timora, is the word punish. For punishment, timora, is to retaliate for evil. It's like vengeance. He chastises, however, for good to those who are chastised collectively and individually." Okay.
Hmm.
And then a little bit later, this just so that you know, if someone wants to look it up, this is from his Stromata number 7. Okay. And it's in paragraph 26. So if anyone wants to look this up, you're welcome to. Um, he says it even more clearly a little bit later in that same passage. He says, God does not wreak punishments and vengeance, um, it, for the sake of justice to Kausune. For punishments, to punish is to return evil for evil, but God chastises only with an eye to the good. Okay. So what I'm trying to establish here is there's a large swath of people when I say because just God forgives, they think that that means that someone who um, sins or does something wrong, they get off scot free because God forgives. And what I'm trying to show is God can forgive, but he can forgive. He can't forgive while he seeks vengeance or while he punishes. But what he can do is he can forgive while disciplining. And he can forgive and show mercy and grace while also chastising. Because both of those are with the way that Clement puts it here is great. God chastises or disciplines with an eye to the good.
Hmm.
The whole point is because I love the person that I'm having to deal with the wrong that they've done, and so I need to find a way to help them return to what is right. So, vengeance and punishment, they can't be done while forgiveness is being done. And so we really need to understand that when we see the word vengeance, it does it really should not be translated that way. And it really should be translated to set things right, which involves discipline and chastisement for our own good. Okay.
Mhm.
All right. Any questions or thoughts on that?
No, the only thought I'm kind of having is that you think through that and other examples of local stories, and I think you can go back to. I think we might have talked about this in the last episode. I can't remember if it was the first part that we recorded in, or if we said it in this. But the the story of Cain and Abel, and Cain killing Abel. The vengeance would have been for when Cain killed Abel, for God to then kill Cain, but he didn't. He chose to forgive him, but he still seeked him to have um uh, the word I'm looking for,
Well,
discipline and correcting and going, and he forgave him. This is why he wasn't killed and why he didn't let anybody else harm a hair on his head. But he still kept him being to come through and become out better on the other side, and not to repeat that again.
right. So he didn't seek retribution or vengeance,
Mhm.
but instead he did seek to discipline, though, right?
Yes.
He
Yep.
said, "You can no longer be here in this
Yep.
specific location." So he exiled him, if you want to use the term exile. He exiled him from that location, um, and that was a form, like you're implying, that's a form of discipline. And so God's heart is never. I want to just establish, because of what was established last week, that it's always just to forgive and always just to show mercy, um, always just to show grace. Um, I want to. I just want to make sure that it's exceedingly clear. That doesn't mean that God can't address wrongs. It just means that when He does address wrongs, He's doing it for the recipient's good, not because He's
Right.
hurt and He's trying to pay back for His hurt, or not because of uh, you retribution, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. You get what you deserve.
Yeah.
Instead, it's all about the goodness and correcting that person for their good.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's you see that played out in the two first stories of God's discipline in the Old Testament. I mean, Adam and Eve being removed from the Garden of Eden, and that story. You could view that as being punishment and God's retribution, setting right. They sinned, therefore I'm kicking them out. But if you look at it more in depth, why did God take them out of in that story of the Garden of Eden? It was for their own good, so that they could see that they couldn't while living in at that point in time. Like
Right.
there was a discipline that came from going through that. And then again, Cain and Abel, there was a discipline that came from that, but he still loved them and didn't just end at a punishment. He kept a discipline going on, continuing thereafter.
Right. So now that we have that established, the only other thing about that passage in Hebrews that we read in Hebrews 10, 28 and 29 and 30, is that the very next line after vengeance, which we've now made clear to set things right, is mine, and I will address appropriately, render appropriately. Um, then it says, and the Lord will judge his people. Now, the problem that we have with the word, I think we have a problem with the word judge or judgment. Um, Now, this is not in a dictionary sense. I think this is just in a conceptual sense. A lot of people, when they read the word judge, they see the word condemn. Okay. But that's not what that means. In my Romans translation, when I came across this word, krino, I translate it as to evaluate. Now, evaluation can come out positive or negative. Um, but basically, it's saying I'm going to take into account everything that's happened, and then I'm going to render a decision on what has taken place.
Which in
And
an English
so,
language, that's a form of judgment. You're making a judgment at that point in time, a judgment call, if you will.
yeah. Yeah, I just think there's a lot of baggage with the word judgment that kind of we always kind of think of it
Sure.
in as condemnation. Um, but you're right. I think in the general sense of what the word actually means, it doesn't. It's neutral. It can be a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah.
Now, in this context, the context tells you whether it's good or bad. And in this context, he's talking about Christians who have basically tread the Son of God underfoot, is how Hebrews writes it. So, in this context, the Lord will evaluate his people. We're probably talking about a negative evaluation, obviously, but the point is that that doesn't mean condemn. If it there's a different word that would be there, different Greek word that would be there, if they wanted to say condemn. So I just want to establish and make sure we're understanding that word does not mean that God's going to condemn. Okay.
Mhm.
All right. So overall, what we've established now is that God will evaluate, right? And if you put the two passages together, when others do wrong, we shouldn't try to correct them ourselves. We should leave room for God to come in so that, because to set things right is His, and He will address it appropriately, possibly, more than likely, with discipline and chastisement. And He will evaluate them to see what the best way of doing that is. Now we're understanding the whole passage in, I think, much more accurate terms, and in terms that don't contradict everything we established last week. This out of he's not evaluating even out of vengeance or a sense of retribution, needing to punish. Instead, he's doing all of this to set things right. Right.
Yeah.
Um, any thoughts on that, Kyle?
Tracking with you.
Then, whenever I get that established, I inevitably get the next question that comes to mind for people is is that, well, wait a minute, if that's the case, why should we fear God? And obviously, in the Hebrews 10:28 through 31 context, the very next verse is, it is a terrifying, fearful hands of the living God. All right. Um, so and this part can be very confusing to people. They're like, well, why should we fear him if he's always going to act out of love? Right.
Yeah.
And usually when someone tries to make this kind of rebuttal, they'll usually you know, quote, you know, if God loves us perfectly, doesn't perfect love drive out fear? Which is a verse in the Bible. So so wait a minute, why am I why is the author of Hebrews saying that I should fear God here? Why is that? And to that, what I have to say is, we need to understand that the Bible, this probably won't be a surprise to you or to any of our listeners. We know it. The Bible a lot of times describes the fear of God as a good thing.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
so let's just look at it. One of the most famous, probably, um, Proverbs 9:10, right? And Proverbs 9:10 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The Holy One is understanding. So here we have this concept that the fear of the Lord is a good thing. It's so good that it's the starting place for wisdom.
Hmm.
Okay. Now, I want to also establish here, we've talked about this before, and like I think is episode 2. Um, wisdom is the Hebrew word that in the New Testament gets translated to logos. So literally, I mean, you could literally say the fear of the Lord is the beginning of the
Wisdom.
logos,
Logos. Yeah.
wisdom. right? So this whole podcast is about the logos of God, the logic of God, and the fear of the Lord is the beginning of that. So fear of God is really, really important. Extremely important. Okay. Now, in order to understand a little bit better, I think it's good to read the other Old Testament verse that says the exact same thing that a lot of people don't even. I don't know. You can tell me if I'm wrong, Kyle. A lot of people don't even think of this verse and are aware that it's there. But Psalm 111 starts with the same thing, but has a different second half. So Psalm 11, 111:10 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." Then it goes on to say, "All those who follow his commands have a good understanding. His praise endures forever." So here we get a link. So not only do we get the statement that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but it's like the corresponding thing, the thing that results because of that is that you follow his commands. Okay.
There's another verse that goes
Okay.
along with
Yeah.
it that you're leaving out here. And if we're going to do the song thing, you can do this as the song part to be able to go on this as well too. So this is an old song, but for him writes it on. It's Psalm 112. So it's blessed is the verse is blessed is the man who fears the Lord, who finds great delight in his command. And there's this blessed is he who fears the Lord. I'm off key. Who finds delight in his anyway. Um,
Okay.
yeah, like I think the
Hey.
same thing you're saying there, it goes back. It's blessed is he who fears the Lord, who finds delight in his commands. Well, if you're fearing, would you find delight in what you're afraid of? Probably not when you're taking it into the context of where we think fear first first and foremost. But as the way that we're putting it in there, if nobody likes to have to go through discipline, but if you taking that upon yourself that you are taking in the joy of the discipline that you're getting and you're finding delight in the commands to make you better, there's delight that comes in that. So another verse you can take that context from.
Absolutely.
Thank you,
And so
David.
you can yeah, absolutely. So these psalms, they're both are this idea is that what results when you fear the Lord is that you do his commands, or you another way of putting that is he's only going to command you to do things that are within his wisdom.
Hmm.
So you're trusting his wisdom because you revere him. And we understand this, I think, in like again, I'm going to use the parent child relationship, right?
Yeah.
Like you fear sometimes when I did things wrong, and who knows, our human fathers, sometimes they can act out of vengeance and act out of punishment, but they can also act out of love and out of um, a sense of just wanting me to learn my lesson. And the fact of the matter is that you can have a healthy fear and reverence for your earthly fathers who are acting in love, and we understand that, and that's what I think is what's being said here. Like, if I revere and fear my earthly father, I'm going to trust that he knows what's best, and I'm going to obey and learn from what he's telling me to do.
Hmm.
And what's being said here is the beginning of actually doing and living out God's logic, God's logos, God's wisdom. The beginning of that is revering God as higher and as the one who's going to evaluate,
Right.
right? Um, so the fear of God is good, and it's always coupled with, or not always, but several places it's coupled with following His commands. Okay, and this is so important. Like Deuteronomy 10:12, um, basically spells it out even more clearly. I think it says, and it's a verse talking to God's people, Israel. Israel, what does the Lord ask of you but to obedience to Him, to love Him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. So the fear is the beginning part of that, and then you're to walk in obedience and to love. So fear, a lot of times, when people are like, wait a minute, if God always acts in love, doesn't that contradict fear? And here it is in the same passage that God is asking them to fear him at the same time as loving him.
Hmm.
They do not contradict. It's not that I have to either fear him or love him, just like I don't have to either fear or revere my earthly father or love him. I can do both at the same time. In fact, when it's someone who's in a position of authority, one of the ways that I show that I love them and that I trust them is by obeying.
Hmm.
Um, and so that hand in hand goes there. Okay. Now, as we go a little bit further, Proverbs 8:13, not only do I obey, but then I start to learn to have the same. I'll say I'll learn to start to have the same logos as God, the same logic, the same reasoning
Hmm.
on the way the world works. And so you get verses like Proverbs 8:13, to fear the Lord is to hate evil, to hate pride and arrogance, evil behavior and perverse speech. Um, and I want to take a minute here, and evil doesn't just mean what we think of when we think of evil. Okay, this is
No.
the word raw.
Hmm.
This is the word raw. So, like in the beginning, in Genesis, you have the tree of Tov and Ra, or we often a lot of times translate that as good and evil. But they don't just mean like what we think of as evil. They mean things not working the way that they're supposed to work.
Right.
So I could have like if my leg was lame, you could call that a raw leg. Um, you wouldn't call it an evil leg, but it's saying it's not the way that the world was supposed to function. I was
Right.
supposed to have a fully functioning leg. Okay. So raw just means something that's not working the way that it's supposed to. So
Right.
the fear of the Lord is to hate or is to reject that which is not the way that it was designed to live in this world, the way it was function in this world, and to hate the things that aren't of the nature that God wanted us. God did not design us for pride and arrogance. And then the behavior that is not in line with God's logos, with His wisdom, and again, perverse speech. That again, that would do the same thing. The words that just are contrary to God's logos and wisdom. So again, you can see it's all kind of going back to the fear of the Lord is the beginning of his logos. Is the beginning
Hmm.
of us being able to comprehend and function in the same way that he does and live by his logos. Okay. And then, in the New Testament, I mean, John, we love John on this podcast, don't we? We quote him a
We
lot.
do. Yep.
But John just comes out and says it. He says, in First John 5, he says, "This is love for God, that we obey His commands, and His commands are not burdensome." What he's saying is, you know, when we obey His commands, it's actually good for us. It's life for us.
Hmm.
So love and obeying are connected here. Um, now, now we get to like the New Testament and passages that seem to contradict the idea that fear is a good thing. And there's two I think that are the most commonly thought of. We already quoted one, and we'll address that one last. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. We're going to address that in a second. But the other one that is very often quoted is 2 Timothy 1:7. For God gave us a spirit, not of fear, but of power and love and sound judgment. What does sound judgment sound like, Kyle?
Uh, Discipline.
Yeah, discipline,
Yeah.
wisdom,
Yep.
logos, like right, logic. So um he didn't give us the spirit that produces fear, but instead he gave us the spirit that produces love and sound judgment. And sound
Yep.
judgment allows us to do what? To
Yeah.
live within God's logos, which means we're going to obey his commands.
Correct. And love
And
others.
yep. And so That's spelled out there in the verse.
Yep.
Power, which means ability to love by living within God's logos
Yep.
and obeying his rules. So they're all coupled together again. But this time it's saying fear is not in the equation. Well, what's the difference? And the answer is actually in that verse that gets quoted to me all the time when I try to teach this, because it's in the second half of the verse.
Yep.
So 1 John 4:18 says this: there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. The second half of the verse then says this: for fear has to do with punishment, not been perfected in love. Now, I actually want to correct this translation. That is not the word that means eye for eye, tooth for tooth. That's the word that means discipline. It's the Greek word that means discipline. So, for fear has to do with discipline, and whoever fears has not been perfected in love. Now, if you read I'm not going to do it tonight, but I encourage you, read the full passage. The whole passage is about us obeying God.
Yes.
That's what the whole passage is about. So, what is being said is that if the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, I think you could easily say the end of wisdom, meaning we've arrived, we're fully doing it,
Yeah.
is loving God perfectly, which John tells us love for God is that we obey his commands. So if I'm obeying his commands, I'm loving, it's not that, yes, we know that God loves us perfectly,
Right.
but it's also perfect love is love that's right on both ends, right? It's right on both ends.
Sanctified, if you would.
Absolutely
We'll get,
sanctified.
we'll get
Yeah.
to that word later, but
Right. So it's now love that's, yes, the Father's loving us appropriately and perfectly, but also a perfect love in a relationship means that I'm loving him perfectly,
correct.
which
You're
means
mirroring.
that I'm obeying his command. Think about it this way. Um, sure, when I'm young, really young, let's say, sometimes I might just be obeying the rules because I fear my dad's going to discipline me.
Hmm.
But then as I get older and I've learned his commands and I've learned that they're good for me and that I should just trust him and obey him out of love, I no longer fear his discipline,
Yep.
which is what that verse is saying. So if the beginning of wisdom is fear, the telos, if you will, the completion of wisdom,
Yeah.
wisdom to its fullest is when I'm loving perfectly by obeying God the Father. And so it's not a contradiction. It is a good thing at first, but that's only the beginning of wisdom. Once I've arrived at wisdom and I'm obeying, then I'm loving perfectly and I no longer fear.
Right. And that ties into 1 Corinthians 13 as well too, with when I was a child, I acted like a child, reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put childish ways behind me. It's that same aspect. When you become mature in the understanding of it, you've put those childish ways away and now you're embracing into it because you've matured and are not acting as a child any longer. And that's the love
Right.
that you
And
give to God and that God gives to you, back and forth, the give and take. You mirror that. I think it also goes, once you've reached a standpoint of maturity, there's it's twofold. You're realizing that you're not wanting to do what is wrong because you know it's not only bad for you and not what's best for you. You also have instead of you being afraid of the punishment, you're afraid of the hurt that you cause the one you love for not obeying and giving into that as well, which is a selflessness that comes, I think, in adulthood much more when you become more of a, not that you can't have that as a child, but it's way less natural. It comes as you get older. You don't want to disappoint somebody because you care about them rather than necessarily worrying about what they're going to do to you in return.
exactly, you're doing it out of love. So
Hmm.
now that you've been perfected in love. Now, why is fear? I mean, in the book of Hebrews, the passage that we've been trying to dissect and expound upon today,
Hmm.
he is writing to Christians, but and he is saying that fear is a part of the equation. But what have these Christians done? They obviously are not perfected in love, which is what
Hmm.
John 4:18 says. First John 4:18 says is that whoever fears has not been perfected in love. They have not been perfected in love. They are still obviously being disobedient. And so, yeah, Hebrews is saying you should fear the fact that God is going to come and evaluate, and he's going to come to set things right, because you have not been living by God's logos, by his wisdom. They all correlate together. Um, but you can't see it unless you understand that the words aren't vengeance, and they aren't. We're not talking about condemnation. We're talking about the fact that God is going to set things right. And when we say set things right, we're saying he's going to line things back to his wisdom. So if you're living by his wisdom already, you don't need to be set right.
Right.
You're already living right.
I think I can paint it in a picture in a physical aspect, if you will, Chris. I think
Okay.
you can look at the aspect of God coming into. Okay, so you've been really unhealthy for a really long time, and you've been living a sedentary lifestyle, eating junk food, resting on the couch, not exercising out, not working. Time comes that you're going to have to be able to do something that's active. The discipline now is going to come where you're going to have to put your body through things that are uncomfortable. You're going to have to give up the things that you enjoy eating for the betterment of your body to improve. You're going to have to work out and exercise and put strain on your muscles that are going to hurt, and there's going to be. I can honestly say, while we all know that there's good things that come from that, does anybody naturally want to do those things? There's a fear of what you know is going to come.
Right.
But we know what comes out on the other side. So we, even though we fear the discipline that we're going to go through and put ourselves through, we do that for what's best for us, and God asks us to do it for what's best for us.
Absolutely. And see, um, this is why it's loving to tell people the truth. Because, and this is a phrase that I coined when I was studying this a long time ago, but I've come to believe this. Um, Either I learn to be self-disciplined, or I eventually will be disciplined
Hmm.
by God. So um just because of natural consequences, that might be what it looks like, or maybe God will come and actually do something that's going to cause me to be disciplined. But if I don't learn to be self-disciplined, we talked about that as a good thing earlier, right? If I don't, if I'm self-disciplined, then he will not need to come and bring discipline. Same thing with the scenario you brought up. If I'm already self-disciplined to where I'm in good shape and I'm able to handle those types of things, when the time comes, I'm gonna be disciplined because it's gonna discipline me
Right.
because I've naturally not done what is right and what is wise. Um, so that's it for our thoughts today. Um, any closing thoughts on our lesson today, as we've thoroughly addressed um, both Romans. I don't think Romans 12:17 through 21, the analogy I gave of a parent saying, I will come, I think that clearly helps us understand that passage that we translate vengeance sometimes. But then I think we've also thoroughly addressed Hebrews 10:28 through 31 and how it works. And it doesn't contradict the fact that God is still just and forgiving and showing mercy. His motive is not from a sense of vengeance and I need to repay this, but instead it's out of he's already forgiven us, but he needs to discipline us for our own good.
Right. Yeah. Good. I don't have any closing thoughts really other than what I've already given on there. So I know our next episode we're going to be coming up. We're going to be talking about hardening wrath and restorative justice. So
That's right. So, um, this is not. As I looked at it and thought about it carefully, I don't think that we can end the topic of justice, even where we've gone today. We now need. I think most of today was discussing God's justice from the viewpoint of a Christian. Now, next week, when we talk about wrath and hardening, um, we're going to discuss, okay, what is he doing? How does God um, act justly, meaning do what is right, with someone who is not receptive to him at all, doesn't want to fall in line in any way, shape, or form.
Mhm.
Um, how does God handle that? And so, the topic of hardening and wrath is, I believe, the topics that address that, and we're going to address that in full detail next week, and then that'll wrap up our justice series.
Yep. Next week or whenever the next episode drops. Hopefully it'll be next week. We'll see. We'll do our best to be able to get into this. So, all right. Well, again, we thank you all for listening. Make sure that if you have not already clicked and liked and subscribed, either through YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, wherever you're listening to, that you go ahead and do that. If you know someone you think would enjoy this, please share that with them and like and comment and give us your thoughts as well. We're happy to respond and continue the conversation outside of this format. So, thank you again for listening. We'll be back again with our next episode again, episode 9, Justice, part 3, Hardening, Wrath, and Restorative Justice. So have a great week, everybody, and we hope you had a wonderful Memorial Day holiday.
All right. Thank you. Have a good one, guys.